Ars Notoria, Episode 5, Chapter 4. The Geometry of Power. Power is positional. Most people misunderstand power because they search for it in the wrong place. They look for strength. They look for authority. They look for visibility. In the visible world, power seems to belong to those who command attention. Leaders giving speeches, institutions announcing decisions, individuals displaying confidence or control. The observer's eye is naturally drawn toward whoever appears dominant in the moment. But appearances are deceptive. In complex systems, power rarely belongs to the most visible actor. It belongs to the actor best positioned inside the structure. Two individuals may possess equal intelligence, equal resources, and equal determination, yet produce dramatically different outcomes. One struggles endlessly, pushing against resistance from every direction. The other moves almost effortlessly, making small decisions that produce large consequences. The difference is rarely force. The difference is position. Position determines how influence travels through a system. It determines whether an action encounters resistance or amplification. It determines whether effort dissipates into the surrounding environment or multiplies as it moves through structural channels. To understand this, imagine a river. A person standing in the middle of the current must fight continuously just to remain in place. Every movement demands energy. Progress is difficult because the flow itself opposes them. But someone positioned near a narrow bend of the river can redirect the water with a small barrier. The same current that resisted the first person now becomes a force that amplifies the second. The river did not change. The position did. Power inside systems behaves in the same way. Actors who misunderstand structure attempt to impose force directly on the system. They push harder. They increase effort. They escalate pressure, believing that greater strength will eventually produce the outcome they want. But systems rarely respond to raw force alone. They respond to structure. A small action placed at the correct structural point can redirect flows that enormous effort elsewhere cannot influence at all. This is why operators study architecture before action. They ask a different question from the observer, not, "How much power do I have?" but, "Where am I standing inside the system?" Because once position becomes visible, the meaning of power changes completely. Power is no longer measured by intensity. It is measured by alignment. Alignment between position and structure. Alignment between action and the pathways through which influence naturally travels. Once that alignment exists, effort decreases while consequence increases. And that is the first principle of the geometry of power. Power is not primarily a property of the actor. Power is a property of position inside structure. Node, corridors, and pressure lines. Once power is understood as position rather than force, another layer of perception begins to open. The operator no longer sees systems as flat environments. Instead, systems begin revealing an internal geometry, a geometry made of nodes, corridors, and pressure lines. To the ordinary observer, systems appear chaotic. Organizations behave unpredictably. Institutions seem inconsistent. Large structures move slowly and then suddenly change direction without warning. But this appearance of randomness is often the result of looking at the system from the surface. Beneath that surface, influence tends to travel along very specific pathways. These pathways form the internal geometry of the system. The first elements of this geometry are nodes. Nodes are points where flows converge. Information arrives from multiple directions. Decisions pass through them. Resources accumulate there before moving outward again. In large organizations, nodes often appear as committees, departments, advisory groups, or decision councils. In technological networks, they appear as servers, protocols, or platforms. In social environments, they appear as individuals or institutions through which communication repeatedly flows. Nodes matter because influence passing through them can travel in many directions. A small change at a node can spread widely across the surrounding structure. The second elements of system geometry are corridors. Corridors are the channels through which influence moves between nodes. Information channels, supply routes, communication networks, financial pipelines, regulatory processes, technological infrastructures. These all function as corridors inside larger systems. Corridors shape the speed and direction of movement. A corridor that carries a large flow becomes a natural highway of influence. Actions introduced into that corridor travel far more efficiently than actions introduced into areas where movement is weak or fragmented. This is why operators do not place effort randomly. They place effort where corridors already exist. The third element is pressure lines. Pressure lines appear where multiple flows begin pushing against each other. Incentives collide. Systems interact. Structural tensions accumulate. At first, these tensions remain invisible. But as pressure increases, the system begins searching for release. This release may appear as a policy change, a market shift, an institutional reform, or a technological breakthrough. Observers often interpret these moments as sudden transformations, but the operator recognizes them differently. They are pressure releases along structural fault lines. Once nodes, corridors, and pressure lines become visible, the system stops looking chaotic. It begins looking architectural. Movement becomes understandable. Influence becomes traceable. And the operator mind begins seeing something that most observers never notice. Every system contains a hidden geometry through which power naturally travels. Why most power is invisible. Once the internal geometry of systems becomes visible, another realization emerges, one that often surprises those encountering it for the first time. The majority of real power is invisible. This statement contradicts the way power is usually portrayed. Public culture tends to associate power with visibility. The most powerful people appear to be the ones constantly present in headlines, speeches, and public debates. They occupy the center of attention, and therefore they appear to occupy the center of influence. But visibility and influence are not the same phenomenon. Visibility belongs to the surface layer of reality. It exists where events become observable and narratives are constructed around them. Influence often operates deeper than that layer. Within systems, influence moves through nodes, corridors, and pressure lines, long before those movements become visible to the public. Decisions are shaped gradually through networks of alignment. Incentives shift behavior quietly across institutions. Structural constraints begin narrowing possibilities before any official announcement reveals that narrowing. By the time the visible event occurs, much of the real influence has already completed its work. Observers see the final act. They rarely see the architecture that produced it. This is why public narratives often misunderstand power. They attribute outcomes to the most visible figures involved in the event. A decision is announced by a leader, and the leader is assumed to be the primary source of influence. A technological platform dominates a market, and the founders appear to have reshaped the world through individual vision alone. But the operator mind studies the architecture beneath those moments. It sees how incentives converged around certain decisions long before they were announced. It sees how networks of institutions gradually adjusted to new conditions before any public declaration acknowledged those adjustments. It sees how structural pressures made certain outcomes increasingly likely, regardless of which individual appeared at the surface. In many cases, visible actors are simply the points where deeper forces emerge into public awareness. They are not the architecture itself. Understanding this difference changes the way the operator interprets events. Instead of asking who appears powerful, the operator asks where influence actually moved before the event became visible. Which nodes transmitted the pressure? Which corridors carried the alignment? Which structural tensions made the outcome increasingly difficult to avoid? When this perspective stabilizes, the world looks different. The surface layer remains dramatic, but it stops being confusing. Because beneath the visible theater, the geometry of power continues to operate quietly, shaping outcomes long before the public notices that anything has changed. Leverage points. Once the geometry of systems becomes visible, nodes, corridors, and pressure lines, the operator begins noticing something even more important. Not every position inside the structure carries the same weight. Some locations inside a system possess an unusual property. A very small action placed there produces a disproportionately large consequence. These locations are known as leverage points. To the observer, systems appear to respond only to large efforts. If something must change, the instinct is to apply greater force, more resources, more pressure, more authority. The assumption is that influence scales with effort. But complex systems rarely behave that way. Most effort placed inside a system dissipates without producing meaningful movement. Energy is absorbed by surrounding structures. Resistance neutralizes the push. The system stabilizes itself and continues functioning almost exactly as before. However, when effort is applied at a leverage point, the system behaves very differently. Instead of resisting the action, the architecture begins amplifying it. The small movement spreads through corridors of influence. It reaches multiple nodes simultaneously. Feedback loops begin reinforcing the change instead of suppressing it. What started as a minor adjustment quickly becomes a directional shift across the entire structure. This is the fundamental asymmetry of leverage. The same action produces dramatically different outcomes depending on where it enters the system. To understand this, imagine a complex network of gears. If you try to move the entire machine by pushing randomly against its outer components, almost nothing happens. The machine absorbs the pressure. Your effort disperses across too many parts at once. But if you apply a small rotation to the correct gear, the one connected to the primary axis of the system, the entire mechanism begins moving. The force did not increase. The position changed. Leverage points exist in nearly every complex system. In technological networks, they appear where platforms concentrate interaction. A small change in the architecture of a widely used platform can alter behavior across millions of participants. In institutional systems, leverage points often appear where decision pathways converge. A minor adjustment in a rule, a procedure, or an incentive structure can reshape the behavior of entire organizations. In information systems, leverage points appear where narratives spread through communication corridors. A subtle shift in framing can redirect attention across networks that amplify and distribute ideas. These points are rarely obvious from the surface. To the observer, systems look uniform. Every part appears equally relevant. The complexity of the environment makes it difficult to determine where influence actually concentrates. But to the operator mind, patterns begin emerging. Some nodes repeatedly transmit influence across multiple corridors. Some corridors carry more flow than others. Some pressure lines repeatedly produce systemic release when tension reaches a certain threshold. Over time, the operator begins mapping these locations. They begin identifying the places where the architecture itself multiplies action. This is why operators rarely attempt to control entire systems directly. They search for leverage points instead. A system does not need to be dominated. It needs to be understood. Once leverage becomes visible, the nature of action changes. Effort decreases. Precision increases. Instead of applying pressure everywhere, the operator places small interventions exactly where the structure is most responsive. The result often appears surprising to observers. A seemingly minor action produces consequences far larger than expected. Observers may attribute the outcome to luck, talent, or coincidence. But the operator understands something different. The system did most of the work. The intervention simply occurred at the point where the architecture was ready to move. And this is the beginning of strategic power. Not overwhelming force, but the quiet ability to identify where structure transforms small actions into large systemic movement. Structural choke points. If leverage points are locations where small actions create large consequences, then structural choke points represent something even more decisive. They are places where the flow of an entire system must pass. Every complex structure contains flows. Information moves through communication channels. Resources move through supply chains. Decisions move through institutional pathways. Capital moves through financial corridors. Attention moves through networks of media and perception. These flows rarely spread evenly across the system. Instead, they converge through narrow passages. These passages are choke points. A choke point is not defined by its size. It is defined by control of flow. A very small node can become extraordinarily powerful if it sits along a corridor that the entire system depends upon. When movement cannot bypass that corridor easily, influence concentrated there becomes disproportionately effective. To the casual observer, these locations are often invisible. They do not necessarily correspond to positions of public authority. They are not always occupied by individuals with impressive titles or large organizations with obvious dominance. In many systems, choke points are hidden within mundane structures, a protocol that defines how information travels across a network, a regulatory rule that determines how financial transactions must be approved, a platform through which communication must pass before reaching a large audience, a logistical junction through which resources must move in order to reach their destination. From the outside, these components appear technical or administrative, yet structurally, they control the flow of the entire system. Consider transportation networks. Thousands of roads may exist across a region, but if most traffic must eventually pass through a single bridge or mountain pass, that narrow location determines the movement of the entire network. The bridge does not look powerful, yet its position controls the system. The same principle appears in information systems. A small platform that becomes the central hub for communication can shape the direction of discourse far beyond its physical size. Messages passing through it gain visibility, while messages outside it struggle to circulate. The architecture of flow determines the architecture of influence. Operators learn to recognize these structural bottlenecks. They ask, where does movement concentrate? Where must the system pass through a narrow corridor? Where does influence accumulate before spreading outward again? When such locations are identified, the geometry of power becomes clearer. Control does not require dominating the entire structure. It requires understanding where the system cannot easily move without passing through a specific point. However, choke points also create vulnerability, because when too much pressure accumulates at a narrow corridor, the system begins searching for alternatives. New pathways appear. New corridors form. Technologies emerge that bypass the restriction. Institutions reorganize themselves to avoid the bottleneck. In other words, choke points are powerful, but rarely permanent. They are temporary concentrations of influence created by the architecture of flow. This is why operators treat them carefully. If they exploit the choke point too aggressively, the system begins adapting around it. But if they understand its position within the wider architecture, they can use it as a subtle lever to redirect movement without triggering immediate structural resistance. The observer often interprets this as authority. The operator recognizes it as geometry. The structure of the system determines where flows must pass, and whoever understands those narrow passages understands where power truly concentrates. The asymmetry principle. Most people assume power scales with size. Larger systems appear stronger. More resources appear decisive. Greater visibility appears dominant. But systems do not operate purely on size. They operate on structure, and structure creates asymmetry. The asymmetry principle describes a simple but dangerous reality. Influence is not distributed evenly across a system. Some positions multiply force, others absorb it, others dissolve it entirely. This means that two actors of vastly different size can produce outcomes that are not proportionally related to their scale. A smaller force, placed correctly, can reshape a larger one. This is not an exception. It is a structural property. To understand this, consider how pressure behaves inside a system. If force is applied evenly across a wide surface, its impact disperses. The system absorbs it without significant change. But if the same force is concentrated at a precise point, the effect becomes dramatically amplified. The system responds not to the total force, but to the distribution of force. This is the essence of asymmetry. In complex systems, this principle appears repeatedly. A minor protocol change can reshape the behavior of an entire network. A single rule adjustment can redirect large flows of capital. A small design decision can alter how millions of people interact with a platform. The magnitude of the cause appears small. The consequences scale far beyond it. Observers often misinterpret this as unpredictability. They see outcomes that appear disproportionate and assume randomness. But from a structural perspective, these outcomes are not random. They are the result of aligned pressure applied at asymmetrical points. This is why operators do not focus on maximizing force. They focus on placing force correctly. They ask, where does a small change propagate outward? Where does influence multiply instead of dissipate? Where does the system amplify input rather than absorb it? When such positions are identified, the dynamics of action change entirely. Effort becomes secondary to placement. Timing becomes secondary to structure. Precision replaces scale. However, asymmetry also explains failure. When force is applied at the wrong location, even large effort produces minimal results. Energy is absorbed. Momentum is lost. The system remains unchanged. From the outside, it appears as if the action was insufficient. In reality, it was misaligned. The structure did not allow amplification. This is why many attempts at change fail, not because the actors are weak, but because their actions are placed where the system is stable. Stable regions resist change. Asymmetrical regions propagate it. Understanding this distinction shifts perception. Instead of asking, how much power is required, the question becomes, where does power multiply? This is a different mode of thinking. It is no longer about accumulation. It is about alignment. At a deeper level, asymmetry reveals something more fundamental. Systems are not neutral environments. They are structured fields where certain actions are favored and others are suppressed. This creates patterns. Certain types of actors consistently succeed, not because they are inherently superior, but because they position themselves within regions where the system amplifies their behavior. Others struggle, even with greater effort, because they operate within regions that dissipate influence. The system itself shapes the outcome. This is the quiet advantage of operators. They do not rely on force alone. They read the structure. They identify where asymmetry exists, and they place their actions accordingly. To an observer, this can appear like foresight or even prediction, but it is neither. It is structural awareness. The system already contains the pathways through which influence will travel. The operator simply recognizes them earlier than others. And once you begin to see these asymmetries, the idea that power belongs only to the largest actors becomes difficult to maintain. Because in structured systems, scale without alignment is noise, and a small, well-placed signal can reshape the entire field. Latent structures. Not everything inside a system is visible at all times. Some behaviors do not exist on the surface. Some pathways do not appear under normal conditions. Some outcomes seem impossible, until suddenly they are not. These are not anomalies. They are latent structures. A latent structure is a pattern embedded within a system that remains inactive until specific conditions activate it. It does not disappear when inactive. It simply waits. Most observers never perceive these structures, because perception is tied to what is currently happening, not to what could happen. They see the system as it behaves now, and assume that behavior defines its limits. But systems are not defined by their current state. They are defined by their potential states. Latent structures exist in that space of potential. To understand this, consider how pressure accumulates in a system. At first, nothing appears to change. The system absorbs small variations without visible reaction. Stability seems intact. Continuity appears guaranteed. Then a threshold is crossed. And suddenly, behavior shifts. What was stable becomes unstable. What was predictable becomes chaotic. What seemed impossible becomes inevitable. The change appears abrupt, but the structure enabling it was present all along. It was simply inactive. This is why many transformations appear surprising. Not because they are truly unexpected, but because the underlying structure was never observed. In complex systems, these latent patterns are everywhere. A network may function smoothly for long periods, while hidden dependencies quietly accumulate beneath the surface. When one element fails, the entire structure reorganizes. A social environment may appear stable, while unexpressed tensions build silently until a single event releases them. A technological system may operate efficiently, while a small design flaw remains dormant until it is triggered under specific conditions. The surface tells one story. The structure contains many. Operators learn to think in terms of activation conditions. They ask, what patterns are currently inactive? Under what conditions would they emerge? What thresholds would need to be crossed? What hidden pathways would become available? This is a different way of seeing. Instead of focusing only on what is visible, they map what is possible. And this creates a form of foresight that is often misunderstood. When an event occurs that others did not anticipate, the operator is not surprised. Because the event did not emerge from nowhere, it emerged from a latent structure that had already been identified. To the observer, it looks like prediction. To the operator, it is recognition. This is also why systems can appear stable until the moment they are not. Stability does not mean absence of change. It often means that change is accumulating invisibly. Latent structures allow systems to hold tension without immediate release. But they do not eliminate that tension. They store it. And when activation conditions are met, the release is often rapid. This creates the illusion of sudden transformation. But the transformation was prepared long before it appeared. Understanding latent structures changes how you interpret time. Instead of viewing events as isolated moments, you begin to see them as activations of pre-existing patterns. Nothing truly emerges out of nowhere. It emerges from a structure that was waiting. This also affects how action is taken. Instead of forcing immediate outcomes, operators sometimes prepare conditions. They recognize that activating a latent structure can be more effective than direct intervention. A small shift in conditions can unlock an entire pathway that was previously inaccessible. This is more efficient than applying force blindly, because the system itself carries the potential. The operator simply aligns with it. However, latent structures are not inherently positive or negative. They can produce growth or collapse, expansion or restriction, order or fragmentation. The outcome depends on which structures are activated and how. This is why awareness matters. A system that is not understood can shift in ways that appear uncontrollable. But a system that is mapped, even partially, reveals its hidden layers. And once those layers are seen, the idea that events are random begins to dissolve. Because beneath the surface of every system, there are patterns waiting to become real. Threshold activation. Most people imagine change as something they can produce directly. They act, they push, they repeat effort. And when nothing happens, they assume the effort was insufficient. So they increase it. But systems do not respond linearly to effort. They respond to state. There is a difference between applying force to a system and acting at a moment when the system is ready to shift. This difference is rarely understood. Because readiness is not visible. Before a threshold is reached, a system behaves as if it is stable. Inputs are absorbed. Disturbances are neutralized. Changes appear temporary and reversible. From the outside, nothing meaningful seems to move. But beneath that apparent stability, accumulation is happening. Every input leaves a trace. Every variation slightly adjusts internal relationships. Every repetition adds to a hidden buildup that is not immediately expressed. The system is not ignoring the input. It is storing it. This is the pre-threshold phase. It is deceptive, because it creates the illusion that nothing matters, that effort is wasted, that change is impossible. Most actors stop here. They misinterpret stability as resistance, and they withdraw before the structure has reached the point where it can transform. But systems have limits to how much tension they can contain. At a certain point, accumulation reaches a boundary, and when that boundary is crossed, the system no longer behaves the same way. It reorganizes. This moment is the threshold. It is not gradual. It is not negotiated. It is structural. Before the threshold, the system absorbs change. After the threshold, it amplifies it. The same input that previously had no visible effect suddenly produces a cascading transformation. Observers often misread this. They see a small action followed by a large outcome and assume the action caused the change. But the action was only the final trigger. The real cause was the accumulation that came before. This is why timing is more powerful than intensity. An action applied too early disappears into the system. The same action applied at the threshold reshapes it. The difference is not in the action. It is in the state of the structure. Operators learn to read this state. They do not ask, how much force is needed? They ask, has the system reached the point where it can no longer remain as it is? This question changes everything. Because once a system reaches that point, change is no longer forced. It becomes inevitable. There are signals that indicate proximity to a threshold. They are subtle. The system begins to react faster to smaller inputs. Stability feels less solid, even if it still appears intact. Minor disturbances create disproportionate ripples. Internal coherence starts to weaken. These are not random fluctuations. They are signs of approaching transformation. The structure is losing its ability to contain accumulated tension. And once that containment fails, release follows. This release is often misinterpreted as chaos, but it is not chaos. It is reorganization. The system is moving into a new configuration that can accommodate the pressure that is built up. And after the transition, a new stability forms. A different structure, with different rules, with new thresholds. This is why operators do not rely on constant action. They observe. They track accumulation. They identify when a system is nearing activation. And they intervene at the moment where intervention multiplies. To an outside observer, this can look like precision, as if the operator chose the exact right moment. But the moment was not chosen. It was recognized. And once you begin to see systems in this way, effort changes meaning. It is no longer about doing more. It is about acting when the structure makes action irreversible. Because real change does not happen when you push harder. It happens when the system can no longer hold itself together in the same form. Structural inevitability. There is a moment in every system where outcomes begin to look predictable. Not to everyone, but to those who understand how the structure is evolving. From the outside, this appears almost unsettling. Certain individuals seem to anticipate events before they occur. They position themselves early. They move before visible signals appear. And when the outcome unfolds, it looks as if they knew in advance. This is often interpreted as intelligence, sometimes even as intuition. In more extreme cases, it is mistaken for something beyond explanation. But in reality, something far more precise is happening. They are not predicting events. They are reading structural inevitability. To understand this, you have to separate two different ways of seeing reality. The first is event-based perception. This is how most people interpret the world. They see isolated moments. They react to visible changes. They connect outcomes to immediate causes. From this perspective, the future appears uncertain, because events have not yet happened. The second is structure-based perception. This is fundamentally different. Instead of focusing on events, the observer looks at the configuration of the system itself. They analyze how elements are connected, how pressure is distributed, where accumulation is occurring, where thresholds are approaching. From this perspective, events are not primary. They are consequences. And once the structure reaches a certain configuration, the range of possible outcomes narrows. At a certain point, multiple outcomes are no longer equally likely. Some become highly probable. Others become nearly impossible. This is the emergence of inevitability. The system is not yet changed on the surface, but internally, it is already committed to a direction. This is why operators appear early. They are not reacting to events. They are aligning with trajectories. Consider a system approaching a threshold. Pressure has accumulated. Latent structures are close to activation. Stability is weakening. From an event-based perspective, nothing definitive has happened. From a structural perspective, the system is already moving. The outcome is not fully visible, but it is increasingly constrained. At this stage, the operator does not need certainty. They need clarity about direction. They ask, what configurations are no longer sustainable? What patterns are about to activate? Which pathways are becoming dominant? These questions reduce uncertainty. Not completely, but enough to act before others recognize the shift. This creates the illusion of prediction, because the action precedes the event. But the action is not based on guessing. It is based on recognizing that the system has reached a point where certain outcomes are structurally favored. In other words, the future is not being seen. It is being inferred from the present configuration. This is a subtle but critical distinction. Prediction assumes unknown information. Structural inevitability operates on known relationships. The system already contains the outcome in potential form. The operator simply identifies which potential is about to become real. This also explains why most people feel surprised by events. They are not tracking structure, they are tracking surface. So when the surface finally changes, it feels sudden, unexpected, even shocking. But the structure did not change at that moment. It had been changing long before. The event is only the visible expression of a process that was already in motion. This is why structural awareness feels like foresight, because it operates ahead of visibility. It recognizes movement before it becomes obvious. However, inevitability does not mean absolute certainty. Systems are complex. Multiple forces interact. Unexpected inputs can still alter trajectories. But within certain configurations, the range of deviation becomes limited. The system is not fixed, but it is constrained. And within those constraints, outcomes begin to cluster around specific directions. Operators work within that narrowing field. They do not need to know exactly what will happen. They need to know what is no longer avoidable. This is a more powerful position, because it allows action before confirmation. And in many systems, timing determines advantage. Those who wait for full clarity act too late. Those who recognize inevitability act at the point where leverage is highest. To others, this looks like anticipation, like foresight, sometimes even like control. But there is no control over the system itself. There is only alignment with its direction. And once you begin to see systems through this lens, the idea of randomness starts to dissolve. Events no longer appear as isolated surprises. They appear as the unfolding of structures that were already in place. And the future stops feeling unknown, not because it is fully predictable, but because it is increasingly shaped by forces that are already visible. If you know where to look. Preemptive positioning. Once structural inevitability is recognized, a different problem appears. Not whether change will occur, but when to act in relation to it. Most people wait for confirmation. They wait until signals are visible, outcomes are discussed, and movement is undeniable. Only then do they act. This feels rational, because acting with confirmation reduces perceived risk. But in structured systems, confirmation comes at a cost. It comes late. By the time an outcome is obvious, the structure has already shifted enough that the advantage of early positioning is gone. The system has moved from formation to expression. At that stage, participation is still possible, but leverage is reduced. Preemptive positioning operates before this point. It occurs in the phase where the structure has already constrained the direction, but the surface has not yet revealed it. This is a narrow window. Too early, and the system has not yet committed. Too late, and the opportunity has already distributed. The operator acts within this interval, not based on certainty, but based on structural alignment. This requires a different tolerance, because preemptive action always carries ambiguity. The outcome is not yet visible. The environment does not validate the move. In fact, from an external perspective, the action may appear premature or unnecessary. This is why most people avoid it. They rely on confirmation because it provides psychological stability. It reduces doubt, but it also eliminates timing advantage. Operators accept a different trade-off. They accept uncertainty in exchange for position. Because once the structure crosses into visibility, the cost of entry increases. Opportunities become competitive. Pathways become crowded. The system stabilizes around the emerging direction, making deviation more difficult. Early positioning avoids this compression. It allows movement while the system is still open. To understand this more clearly, consider how transitions unfold. In the early phase, multiple possibilities still exist. The structure is evolving but not yet fixed. In this phase, positioning is flexible. Small adjustments can still shift direction. As the system approaches inevitability, flexibility decreases. Certain paths become dominant, others fade. At this point, entering the dominant pathway early provides disproportionate advantage. Because the system has not yet fully committed, but it is already favoring that direction. This is the optimal positioning zone. After the transition becomes visible, the system reorganizes. New rules emerge. Barriers increase. Competition intensifies. Positioning becomes reactive instead of strategic. The difference between these phases is subtle, but it defines outcome. Preemptive positioning depends on recognizing when a system has passed the point of neutrality, but has not yet reached full expression. This is where structural reading becomes actionable. The operator asks, has the system narrowed its possible directions? Is one pathway becoming structurally dominant? Is the transition close enough that early alignment will be rewarded? If the answer is yes, action follows. Not aggressively, but precisely. This precision is important, because acting preemptively does not mean acting blindly. It means acting with awareness of constraint. The operator is not forcing the system. They are aligning with the direction the system is already moving toward. This is why preemptive positioning often appears effortless in retrospect. Once the outcome becomes visible, the earlier action looks obvious. Observers assume the operator had special insight, but the insight was structural, not predictive. It came from recognizing that the system had already reduced its possible futures. However, there is risk. If the structure is misread, positioning can occur too early or in the wrong direction. In that case, the system may shift differently, and the early position becomes misaligned. This is why preemptive positioning is not based on a single signal. It requires convergence, multiple indicators aligning, pressure accumulation, asymmetry, latent activation, and narrowing pathways all pointing in the same direction. When these elements align, the probability of structural inevitability increases, and acting within that window becomes justified. The key distinction is this: Reactive actors wait for the system to reveal itself. Operators position themselves where the system is about to reveal itself. This difference creates asymmetry of outcome, because in most systems, advantage belongs not to those who act correctly, but to those who act before correctness becomes obvious. And once you begin to operate this way, timing is no longer about speed. It is about entering the structure at the moment where it is no longer undecided, but not yet visible. That is where positioning becomes power. Invisible advantage. From the outside, certain outcomes look like luck. Someone moves early, something shifts in their favor. The system reorganizes, and suddenly, they are in a position others struggle to reach. Observers call this timing, sometimes intelligence, often luck. But in structured systems, what appears as luck is usually something else. It is invisible advantage. Invisible advantage forms when positioning occurs before the system becomes legible to everyone else. At that stage, the structure has already begun to narrow its possibilities, but the surface still appears open. This creates an asymmetry of awareness. A few actors recognize the direction, most do not. Because the signals are not yet obvious, they exist beneath the surface. In accumulation, in asymmetry, in latent activation, in threshold proximity. These signals are subtle. They do not announce themselves. They require interpretation, and those who read them begin to align early. At first, nothing happens. The position appears neutral, even unnecessary. There is no visible reward, no confirmation, no immediate validation. This phase is critical because it filters out reactive behavior. Most actors do not stay in positions that do not produce immediate results. They withdraw. They reallocate attention. They move toward areas where outcomes are already visible. But invisible advantage requires persistence within a structure that has not yet expressed its shift. This creates a delay between positioning and outcome. During this delay, the advantage remains hidden. It is not recognized, not by others, often not even fully by the one holding it. Then the system transitions. The latent structures activate. The threshold is crossed. The dominant pathways become visible. And suddenly, the position that previously seemed neutral becomes central. What was early becomes optimal. What was unnoticed becomes decisive. At this moment, the advantage appears to emerge instantly, but it was built over time. It was embedded in the structure before the system revealed it. This is why observers misinterpret it. They see the outcome, but not the accumulation. They see the alignment, but not the preparation. They see the result, but not the position that existed before it mattered. So they assign the outcome to luck, because the process that produced it was not visible. Invisible advantage also compounds. Once the system reorganizes, positions that were aligned early gain additional leverage. They are closer to the new flow, closer to the new center of activity, closer to where influence now accumulates. This creates a feedback loop. Early alignment leads to better positioning. Better positioning leads to more access. More access leads to further advantage. And from the outside, it looks like acceleration, as if one actor is moving faster than others. But speed is not the cause. Position is. This is why invisible advantage is difficult to replicate, because by the time it becomes visible, the conditions that created it are already gone. The system has stabilized around the new structure. Entry points have shifted. Opportunities have narrowed. Late actors can still participate, but they cannot recreate the same conditions. They are operating in a different phase of the system. This creates a persistent gap, not because of capability, but because of timing relative to structure. Operators understand this. They do not chase visible advantage. They look for positions that are not yet recognized as advantageous. They accept the delay. They remain aligned during the phase where nothing appears to happen, because they understand that advantage is not created at the moment of visibility. It is revealed at that moment. This is a fundamental shift in perception. Instead of asking, where is advantage right now? The question becomes, where will advantage become visible once the system transitions? This question changes behavior. It moves attention away from the present surface and toward the underlying structure. And once you begin to operate this way, the concept of luck starts to dissolve. Not completely, but significantly. Because outcomes no longer appear random. They appear as the unfolding of positions that were established before they mattered. And those positions were not accidental. They were structural. Placed where the system was already moving, before it showed that movement to everyone else. The operator's frame. At this point, the distinction becomes unavoidable. There are those who experience systems, and those who read them. The difference is not knowledge, it is orientation. Most people move inside systems as participants. They react to events. They respond to visible change. They adjust based on outcomes that have already unfolded. Their reference point is always the surface. What has happened? What is happening? What can be confirmed? From this position, the world feels unstable because events appear suddenly, opportunities appear briefly, outcomes seem unpredictable, and timing always feels slightly off. Not because the system is chaotic, but because perception is anchored too late. The operator's frame shifts this completely. It moves perception away from events and toward structure. Instead of asking what is happening, the operator asks, what is forming? What is accumulating? What is becoming constrained? This changes how reality is interpreted. Events are no longer the starting point. They are the final expression, the visible layer, the consequence. Everything that matters begins before that, in accumulation, in asymmetry, in latent structures, in threshold proximity, in narrowing pathways. These elements define direction long before direction becomes visible. And once you begin to see them, a different kind of clarity emerges. Not certainty, but constraint. You do not know exactly what will happen, but you begin to understand what cannot continue, what is no longer stable, what is already shifting beneath the surface. This is enough, because action does not require full prediction. It requires alignment with direction. This is the core of the operator's frame. It is not about control. It is not about forcing outcomes. It is about recognizing where the system is already moving and entering that movement at the moment where it becomes irreversible. This reframes power. Power is no longer tied to size, or visibility, or intensity. It becomes tied to position within structure, where you are relative to flow, relative to thresholds, relative to activation points, relative to inevitability. From this perspective, many assumptions collapse. Large actors can be ineffective. Small actors can be decisive. Effort can be wasted. Minimal action can reshape entire systems. Luck becomes questionable. Timing becomes structural. And events lose their illusion of randomness. They become readable, not because they are simple, but because they are prepared in advance by the system itself. This is why operators often appear detached, not emotionally, but perceptually. They are not anchored to the same layer of reality. While others focus on outcomes, they focus on formation. While others react to movement, they observe direction. While others wait for confirmation, they recognize constraint. This creates distance, not in awareness, but in timing. They are positioned earlier, which is why their actions often seem disproportionate in effect. However, this frame carries responsibility, because once structure is visible, ignorance is no longer possible. You begin to see when systems are approaching thresholds. You recognize when pressure is accumulating. You notice when pathways are narrowing, and you understand when outcomes are becoming constrained. This awareness changes how you move. You can no longer rely on reaction alone, because reaction is always late. You begin to act in relation to formation, in relation to structure, in relation to inevitability. And this is where the chapter closes, not with a conclusion, but with a shift. Because what has been outlined here is not a technique, it is a way of seeing. And once that shift happens, it does not reverse easily. You cannot return to interpreting events as isolated. You begin to see the underlying architecture in everything. And this leads to the next phase. Because reading structure is not the final layer. It is the entry point. In the next chapter, we move further, from recognizing systems to understanding how to operate within them without triggering resistance. Because the greatest form of power is not force. It is movement that does not create opposition. And that requires a different level of precision. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the new chapters and episodes.